Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. For nearly a year, the world has been transfixed and horrified by what's happening in the Gaza Strip. Yet, for all of the media coverage, there seems to be far less known about how this war is actually being fought. And the how of this conflict, and of the enormous human toll, might end up being its most enduring legacy. In April, the Israeli magazine Plus 972 published a story about how the Israeli military was using an AI system called Lavender to identify and select potential members of Hamas to be targeted by airstrikes. I remember reading that story back in the spring and being shocked that this kind of system was already being used at this scale. P.W. Singer was less surprised. Singer is one of the world's foremost experts on the future of warfare. He's a strategist at the DC think tank New America and a consultant for everyone from the U.S. military to the FBI. So if anyone is going to help us understand the black box of autonomous weaponry and AI warfare, it's P.W. Singer. So let's get right into the conflict I just raised here. How would you describe the role AI is playing in the current conflict in Gaza?
In many ways, the role of AI is a bit parallel to what's happening in our own lives. It's offering a set of decision aids that allow us to make decisions more rapidly, draw in greater amounts of information, but also, just like in our civilian lives, maybe things are going too far, or we're using technologies that we don't fully understand, and certainly that we're using technologies that we haven't yet set all the proper rules and guardrails of it.
So can you tell me how they're using it? So give me some examples of what's the technology, how is it being deployed?
So you can think about this revolution in AI and robotics is touching on both hardware and software. And from the very start of this conflict, we've seen that on the hardware side. Indeed, when Hamas launched the horrific attacks in October, they used not just human attackers, but also drones, in part to overwhelm the Israeli defense systems. And then they blasted out imagery of their crimes on social media, deliberately using algorithms, AI algorithms, to try and expand their impact. Israel then hits back with the counter strikes into Gaza that same thing have used drones, etc. But where this has gone into a new level is the use of a set of AI systems to essentially help the Israelis gather more data than ever possible before in war, process it faster than ever possible before, and then use that to help them make decisions, including on decisions of what buildings to target, what people to strike at. So there's a set of different technologies, but two in particular have gotten a lot of reporting. One translates as the gospel. It draws in data that might be gathered by everything from drone feeds, intelligence reports, to even seismic data, movements of the earth, to help identify a list of what buildings to strike at. Then there's another related system called Lavender that basically does the same thing for people. It provides a number between 0 to 100 reportedly of your likelihood of being a Hamas member. And it determines that based off of everything from intelligence reports, what WhatsApp group you're in, to your proximity to explosions and other news events, and when you turned your cell phone on or off. And it supposedly was able to identify over 30,000 people as Hamas members on its rating scale. Now, the compilation of this data, the Israelis say the algorithms applied to it has on firsthand allowed them to bring in more data than any human could ever go through, any team of human could ever go through. Essentially, they say that it is the equivalent of taking their human intelligence teams and multiplying them by 50. That's 50.
In terms of what? By what metric? The
In terms
capacity?
of time, capacity, in terms of insights,
But how
time.
about accuracy? Do we have any sense of
Well,
how?
that's where we get that's therein lies the crux of it. So on one hand, it's able to generate out often in real time. These are the building targets. These are the individual targets. Allows you to bring together all of this data. Allows you to make decisions much more rapidly. Now, that has allowed Israel to strike at a speed and a scale that it couldn't do before. So, for example, in the first couple months of this war in Gaza, it struck targets at roughly 3 times the speed and the scale than it did in the prior war in Gaza that had lasted many more months longer. Now you get to your question, which is, okay, but what about accuracy? Basically, you're asking about, what's the downside of this? If we get more efficiency, if we get more speed, then you've got the issue of what are some of the other challenges here. So one is with any AI system, again, whether it's you using it for shopping at Amazon, to a doctor using it for prognosis, to a military using it for targeting, the first thing is it's only as good as the quality of the data that's going in and the judgment calls that are being made in that data, the assumptions that are being made in that data.
So what data is going into these then?
Yeah, take the idea of were you a member of a WhatsApp group with another Hamas member? Were you nearby a explosion? Did you turn your cell phone on when you were nearby another explosion? You could look at that and go, okay, those are pretty good indicators that you're a fellow member of Hamas. On the other hand, you're in a WhatsApp group with a Hamas member. It could be you're a family member of them, but you're not in Hamas. Or you turn your cell phone on, you're nearby when there have been explosions. A good indicator you could be in Hamas. Also, maybe it's an indicator that you're a journalist or a firefighter. So that's the first aspect. The other is the idea that humans are still making decisions within this. So a human is, for example, deciding what's the error rate that I'm willing to tolerate. Nothing is perfect in life. Nothing is perfect in war. Nothing is perfect with AI. So go back to that idea of it's giving you a rating scale of your likelihood of being Hamas. It'll never, ever, ever be 100%, right? But the human is deciding, okay, this target list machine that I want from you, do I only want people with 99% level of certainty, 98, 97? And at least according to reporting, at one point in time, they were accepting a 10% error rate. Again, there's nothing perfect in life. There's nothing perfect in war. If you are striking targets within a populated area, there's going to be a risk of civilian casualties. Now, you can apply AI to that problem set, identifying where the civilians are, bringing in data in terms of the likely blast radius of the bomb or missile that you're using. And so it allows a kind of prediction of civilian casualties that wasn't possible before. But then you get the question of, okay, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to say anytime it predicts a civilian casualty, we're not going to strike that target? Or what's the number of projected civilian casualties that we're willing to accept? And at least, again, according to the reporting, they were willing to tolerate up to 15 projected civilian casualties for a low-level target and up to 100 for a potential high-level target. Now, that's changed at different points in the operation. But again, the way to think about this is you're getting the power of the AI, but it doesn't move human responsibility, human accountability out of the equation. It's a little bit like if you were booking a hotel. Now, through AI, you'd go online and it would be able to search out all the prices in real time. But you would say, okay, machine, I only want 3 and 4 star hotels. You would set those parameters and it would spit out the list. You still have to decide whether to buy or not. It's the same thing here. So my point is, by making this sort of light parallel of this very dark topic, is when people talk about AI, they want to make it as if the machine's making all the decisions, that somehow we've handed it off to the machine. No, there's still human responsibility involved.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting parallel for a whole host of reasons. I mean, one, just the somewhat grotesque nature of the difference between shopping versus killing, right? And these are very similar technologies powering both. I mean, that's where we've ended up in the current phase of AI, right? Where we have these very similar technologies being deployed in vastly different contexts. But I guess the other thing that might happen is that the AI can learn our behavior and can learn what might make us more likely or less likely as an individual at the end of that chain to hit purchase or potentially to hit kill, right? Like, it's not impossible that if you're the human at the end of that AI process deciding whether a bomb is going to be dropped, that you are also the subject of the influence of that algorithm, right? And the learned behavior of that algorithm.
So that doesn't appear to be the case in the current systems that they're using. However, as we design systems that are learning, that become more tailored to different scenarios and situations, that could be the case. So as an example, there is a very similar kind of decision aid system that's being developed for NATO militaries, US, Canadian, etc. And it's trained off of the fire orders when you fired a cannon, as an example, in Afghanistan. And the idea is that the AI will, in the future, be able to get similar kind of data and pre-write a fire order for you, which would speed it up, right? And so it changes it from being multiple people going through the data, debating it, etc. It hands the commander essentially,
Pre-drafted
exactly
strategy and implementation.
Exactly. And so the commander still gets to say yes or no.
Yeah.
Now, very quickly, we can, see the efficiency of it. It speeds it up, brings in a lot more data. We could say, it moves out human error, human emotion, all those things that definitely lead to bad outcomes in war. You could also flip it around and go, okay, the first is the problem of algorithmic bias. Basically, if the data set that you're training from is biased, if it is too much of one type, then it's mistrained. You have the other part of it, which is even if the human is in charge at the end, when you do everything for the human, they tend to actually overtrust the AI. The machine must know something that I don't know, so I'm going to do what it tells me to do.
Yeah, and you can imagine all sorts of scenarios where the people who are either programming the machine or overseeing its deployment might want to convince people to do certain things that they might, as individuals, be willing or able to do.
Well, now you've opened up a whole different part of it. I think you were thinking of it of like kind of manipulation in terms of like, I want to make you do something in war that you as a human wouldn't do. For the most part, we've not seen that. The door that's been opened up, though, is the idea of the cybersecurity of all of this. Could you hack into either the decision system itself? Am I affecting its algorithm? Am I tricking it in some way? So you've got that at the front end of it. But you also have the idea of, maybe you could hack into the training data that might not be as secure. So if the machine is being trained off of some kind of data set, maybe I poison the well so that not just a month, but a year, 2 years from now, your AI starts making some squirrely decisions. And one of the things that's also again a power, but a challenge of AI in our own lives and in warfare are these issues that come out of it being what's called a black box. And it's the idea that the more capable, the more complicated it becomes, it makes decisions, it makes recommendations that we can't understand why exactly it did. And if we could, well, then we really wouldn't need it. But it also increasingly can't communicate to us why it made that decision or how it made that decision. And so you get this really interesting outcome where it all turns on trust.
I want to come back to that point about trust and explainability in a moment, but just to touch back on Gaza, because here is a case where we really do see these technologies being deployed at pretty large scale. And part of the rationale for doing so, at least made by the Israeli government, was that this would make war more humane. Do you think that's happened?
I'm gonna, answer you by not answering you, which is, I find the idea of describing war as more or less humane, right? And it goes back to that kind of percentage scale, right? So is it 1% more humane, 10% more humane? What does that mean, right? I just at the end of
But do
the
you think
day,
it's but I think you could imagine both scenarios where the AI has led to more civilian casualties because there's been more ease with which we've targeted and selected and coded the error rates and on and on and on that led to more casualties. Or you could imagine a world in which it would have been mass carpet bombing, perhaps, without precision. And so, I do think we can play with that notion, right?
yeah, and that now you're starting to break it down into these aspects of, you're saying your definition of war as more humane is reduced civilian casualties. And that's again, we could have a back and forth on, but what about,
what's another one? Just out of curiosity,
well, you would, I mean, for example, are you okay with a soldier being tortured? Or the how long a war lasts, or another issue, and now we're getting totally wonky, but you've got jus ad bello, jus in bello. So the idea of both conduct within the war, but then there's like why the war is happening, how long the war is happening, right? But let's just go back to that civilian casualty issue. Yeah, you can see, and that's what we were talking through, on one hand, through the application of these various technologies, if you so choose, you can be much more accurate, much more tailored, much more precise. And that's everything from you're more likely to know the circumstances in which civilians are likely to be harmed or not. You can tailor the type of weapon to be used. So one of the other issues that's played out, and again, we've seen Israel make different decisions at different times, is what size bomb are you using? Are you using a bomb that's 100, 250 pounds of explosives or 2,000 pounds of explosives? Are you taking down the whole building or just trying to hit a part of the building?
Is AI directing those kinds of tactical decisions as well?
Well, now go back to us talking about the decisions that you make, right? The AI doesn't decide this is the bomb that I'm going to load on the
But
plane.
it could recommend one with
It could recommend, but it recommends it based off of you saying, I want X number of civilian casualties. Don't give me any options under this number of civilian casualties. So I don't want to make it sound like the Israeli leader in that situation is somehow, by saying I'm using AI, it's out of my hands. No, again, the decision comes back to them. We often it's become this kind of both horror at the idea that we're using it, but also this idea that somehow it removes human responsibility and culpability. It does not. There's still a human involved in some decision at some point. even if it is just to use the AI itself.
Yeah, and I wonder I think it might change who the human is that we ultimately need to hold responsible. I mean, I do think there's a risk, right, of saying it's literally just the person who clicked kill when hundreds of potential other humans touched that system that led to that decision, whether it was a coder or a data collection agency or a data broker that sold the data or a government that purchased the tool, or right, there's many humans, but I wonder if does that change who we should think of the humans are that need to be held accountable in war for decisions that ultimately kill people.
Absolutely. And it's an issue that goes back to Dr. Frankenstein and his monster. Do you hate the creation, or is it the creator, or is it the angry citizens, the villagers who chased after the monster, which really wasn't a monster? Or go to the recent, Oppenheimer movie, right? Is it the people that decided to drop the bomb? Is it the scientists who either knowingly or unknowingly played a process in it, right? It's the same phenomena playing out on our streets right now. And it's a subject of actual multiple lawsuits. If I have the data correct, I believe we've had over 40 people die in some kind of car accident that involved a Tesla. And so, who do we blame? Was it the human inside the Tesla? Was it the responsibility of the company? Was it the responsibility of the programmers and maybe the owner of the company that essentially programmed out a system that wasn't ready to deal with situations that happen all the time, such as people walking outside a crosswalk, right? This is like a live legal issue.
It is, but at least we're doing it within the construct of a centuries old legal system that has been playing with these forms of liability and accountability and has checks and balances within it, right? As you know better than I do, like the laws of war are much more fluid. What are the restrictions on this in a war fighting construct?
Well, that's where you go to this debate in the field as to whether we need an entire new, Geneva Conventions equivalent for things like cyber warfare for AI, or you say no, whether you use a fork or you use waterboarding, torture's wrong. Whether you kill a civilian with a spear or a drone strike, civilians are supposed to be protected in war.
Where do you land on that? I mean, I think that's a fascinating.
To me, it's the laws of war really don't care about the specific technology. They, for the most part, care about these kind of rules of behavior, right? It's the same thing going back to the Geneva Convention's creation in the wake of World War II. There was the idea of command responsibility. The German commanders, they couldn't say, well, I didn't, pull the trigger in the firing squad, but they gave the order. And that's the same thing here, that responsibility of some kind of war crime, it's not just on the trigger puller, it's on the decision maker, the enabler. Now, where you get thorny is new technologies that kind of disaggregate or move those decisions back in ways that are complex over time. So kind of the software may have been written years earlier or something like that. You've also got another issue playing out, which is you use the term liability. Liability is, a little bit more of like a corporate term. Like you wouldn't have talked about liability so much back in World War II if you were thinking of, was that aerial raid okay or not? But now we're talking about companies and multinational companies and algorithms. And so maybe they do have some liability. And we're definitely going to see lawsuits coming out of this that are going after the companies themselves.
Well, particularly since many of these are dual use technologies. I mean, some of our largest tech companies like Google and Microsoft also have contracts with militaries and police forces around the world.
Absolutely. And then sometimes those companies, if they work for government, they'll claim certain kinds of immunity by saying, well, but this was an issue of war. This was sold to the government. It's not my responsibility. I think the big takeaway for me, again, whether we're talking about robotic cars or robotic weapon systems, is it's really not great to beta test it, which is a Silicon Valley idea, push it out in the world and learn from it, as opposed to deeply testing it out, wargaming it, trying to understand all the potential mistakes that might happen before you use it in the real. Unfortunately, with a lot of these technologies, they've been pushed out just right into the field. And then okay, let's get the 2.0 version. And that's the case where we're talking about cars. That's the case with certain weapon systems. The other aspect is for everyone to be very clear from the very start that they bear some kind of human responsibility for its use.
So I want to come back to Gaza in a bit, but I'm also really curious about your positioning in all of this. You've worked at a think tank, in academia, you've consulted for military, for the FBI, but recently you've started writing fiction. Why is that?
Yeah, so I wear two hats. You and I have been talking wearing I would call it my nonfiction hat, my professor hat. But over the last several years, I've had this pretty wild experience where we call it the approach useful fiction. And the idea is the oldest communication technology of all is actually story. And we bring together nonfiction research and narrative. And the idea is to figure out how can you share real world lessons and insights through story. A different way of thinking about this is science fiction, techno thrillers. I love them, but at the end of the day, they're designed for entertainment and they are ungrounded often for that purpose.
And they've often served to aggrandize the very technologies or make seem inevitable the very technologies.
Well, they can have a real world effect, and the parallel that I like for them is think of them as a milkshake. And there's sometimes really good things in a milkshake. There's strawberries in a strawberry milkshake, but that's not why it's really there. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a government policy report, an intelligence report. It's the kale of our policy world. And so what we're after with useful fiction is a smoothie. Start with the actual research, start with the actual fruits and vegetables, but wrap them into a scenario-based story. And the idea is backed by science. It's not just that the target audience is more likely to consume it, it's that the vitamins are more likely to be absorbed. And so what we've been doing in both books for the open market, but also projects for organizations that range from NATO to the US military, is figure out what are these tough problems, these tough topics that people are having a hard time understanding, having a hard time reaching people, and let's wrap them within story as a means to be more effective at it.
But how do you, because you're not just stating facts, you're projecting potential futures based on directional facts, right? And I'm just curious how you build that sense of what the future could be based on what we know now, right? Because there isn't necessarily a linear path there. And how do you think about certainty and probability of these things happening? And because it seems there is a risk at some point of projecting a future that wasn't inevitable.
100%. And that's the key here is to disentangle your goal and the process. We're very clear that the goal is not prediction. You may not be trying to predict. You may be trying to prevent. You may be painting a scenario of this is the way the world could look if we don't get our act together. So, for example, we did a project for a US Congress report on cybersecurity. And so rather than the normal executive summary with like bullet points, what we did is we took the key ideas that they wanted shared, but framed it in a day after story. It's a story written from the perspective of a congressional staffer after there's been this major cyber attack, and they're too late. They should have listened to the report, but they didn't. And this is what happened. And very different than regular sci-fi or fiction, you got to have the references. You got to have the report. So when someone says, well, could that be real? Yeah. And here's where you can find out more information about it.
So just to maybe wrap where we began here. I mean, I listened to an interview you gave in front of a room full of military personnel, and you said that you thought the first battles of World War III have already been fought. We just don't know it yet. I'm really curious why you think that and what those could be.
We see in our military operations, the world is now what they call multi-domain. So it's not just that you're fighting on land, air, sea, like back in World War II, but you also have battles in these locations that either we couldn't reach before, outer space, or they literally didn't exist before, cyberspace. But it's not just that you have battles in those spaces, is that you have connections between them. And that also means that the timeline is thrown off. So, for example, a dogfight between two jet fighters in a future war could be decided by a cyber hack of a microchip supply chain months or even years earlier. Or a different example, to go to one of these scenarios that we talked about. That scenario is from a project called Ghost Fleet, and it going back to the idea of preventing rather than predicting a future. There are certain elements of that book that we did that will never ever come true because it actually spawned 3 different US government investigations to keep things that we had in the book from coming true, including that specific scenario that we just
That's
talked about.
remarkable, huh?
It points to the power of story, right?
I'm actually kind of glad. I mean, I read that book and was terrified about that prospect. So I'm kind of glad someone else was too, and with the power to change the course there. But
Or we have another scenario on a project we're working on where, think about a potential war against China, and who controls the Pacific will depend on the survival of American ships, maybe Canadian ships, but their survival at sea may depend on who controls outer space. But controlling outer space is actually potentially decided by the location and operation of your satellite control stations that are located not just in China, but are being constructed in these Belt and Road, where China's growing its influences across Asia, Africa, Latin America. And so that threat to a Canadian or American warship in a future fight might be decided by China gaining influence in that, say, Latin American country through an infrastructure deal or a loan deal, and then alongside it saying, and you're also going to allow me to put this ground control station here, right? And so it's just this, to make a sci-fi parallel, it's not chess, it's the 3-dimensional chess that they used to play in Star Trek. Moves across domains, but also timelines.
If that is true, right, and we do have the seeds or the first components of a world war playing out here, I mean, surely we should be doing everything we possibly can to avoid it and to stop it and to ensure it doesn't progress. And so how do you think we should be thinking about this, or what do we need to be thinking about in order to avoid the progression of another world war? I mean, the worst possible thing that could happen, really.
So if we think about the past 2 world wars, they started actually in very different ways. One, World War II was a set of very deliberate choices to go to war. Invasion of Poland, Pearl Harbor. World War I was basically a crisis that spun out of control. If you go back and read the diaries of the leaders in Europe, when the Archduke was killed, none of them wrote in their diaries, today a world war began. So my point is that world wars start either through deliberate choices or through confusion, chaos, mistake, crisis. So on the first, what you want to do to prevent that is the very same things that were used to keep World War III from ever starting during the Cold War. You want to create deterrence such that each morning the leaders wake up and say, today is not the day to go to war. And so you'd want to be building up your defenses, your resilience from cyber attacks. You'd want to be ensuring that the adversary knows you have a capability. It's all the sorts of, essentially the standard deterrence theory. It's uncomfortable to talk about. Building up military capability does not mean you always want to invade the other side. But then we have this other aspect, which is the crisis, the confusion that spins out of control. And those are more likely to happen in the early stages of an industrial revolution when there's a new kind of technology that the players don't understand well and they miscalculate over. So you go back to World War I, and when they thought about the railroad and new things like the machine gun and fast firing cannon, they actually thought that it privileged the offense and that whoever went to war first would inevitably win. And that's why we all got to make sure to mobilize first. And instead, they turned out to be completely wrong, right? Instead, it led to this static trench warfare, privilege the defense. They didn't well understand it. It's the same thing if you think about the most scary periods of the Cold War, when it seemed we were closest to nuclear conflict. It was these early stages when they didn't well understand the dynamics, or they had a cavalier attitude about nuclear weapons. So that's the parallel now with things like cyber, AI, robotics.
I mean, not understanding and being cavalier about implications describes our current AI moment pretty well.
Yeah, we want leaders to, one, understand it, two, not be consumed by misunderstanding, but also importantly, not have this kind of false confidence so that they get into almost like a use it or lose it mentality. And so that's where you want to be, again, building up both your understanding, but also setting up the rules of the road, the kind of laws, norms that we've talked about, which again was the case throughout the Cold War, where, the Warsaw Pact and NATO didn't agree about everything. They were preparing to fight with each other, but they did set up things like, the lines of communication to, they even were able to negotiate certain treaties, the outer space treaties, certain weapons treaties. I think that is a possibility in our world today. I'm not saying we're suddenly going to agree with China, but we can, both parties say, you know what, it's not in our interest for X, Y, or Z to happen. Let's figure it out, even while we're arming against each other.
Are you scared about where this is headed, knowing all this, knowing where we are and the moment we're in? And
my writing partner, August Cole, has a quote, so I'm going to steal from it. He says, I'm an optimist who's staring into the abyss. So you can't look at all these different trends and not, be scared by certain parts of them. And I mean, we haven't, you and I haven't even talked about, I mean, the thing that scares me more is our domestic political trends.
why are you an optimist, though? I don't. Hearing this last hour, I'm finding it hard to be optimistic myself.
I have to be to do what I do, right? If you're going to write about these topics, you're doing it with a purpose. You're doing it with a purpose that this assumption that, people, if they are more informed, they can make better decisions. If they have a bit of understanding, they're not going to be taken in by those hucksters. If you paint a scene of something really horrible, they can synthetically experience it and go, you know what? I don't want that to happen. I don't want to live that. It was bad in the novel. What am I going to do to keep that from happening in reality? So that's that optimism thing, because if you were a true pessimist, I mean, you'd run for the hills and be inside a bunker, right? You wouldn't even attempt to understand or write it. You would just be.
As many of the people building these technologies have already prepared for.
They all seem to believe somehow that New Zealand's going to be spared by it. But bad news for them.
Probably not. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, thank you for the work you're doing on this and your optimism and for talking to us about it.
I appreciate you having me.
Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. The show is produced by Mitchell Stewart. Our associate producer is Sequoia Kim. Executive producers are Kathleen Goldhar and James Millward. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. A special thanks to Matt Frainer and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you liked the interview you just heard, please subscribe or leave a rating or a comment. It really helps us get the show to as many people as possible.